Okay, code duplication. That's another code smell that we should avoid at all times. Why? Because when you duplicate code, if you need to change it, you need to make that change in multiple places. Plus, duplicated code makes your code noisy and hard to understand. There is a principle called DRY, which stands for don't repeat yourself. Okay, let's take a look at a real-world example. You can find this example in Solution Explorer under Duplicated Code folder. So let's see what's happening here. In this class, we've got two methods, admitGuest and updateAdmission. We're assuming this code is part of an application used at a hotel. When guests arrive, they get checked in, or sometimes their details get updated. Without getting lost in details of business logic or data access code, let's just have a quick look at these two methods. So here is our admitGuest method. We've got some logic here on the top, which I got rid of. And then we've got this logic here, which is trying to parse a string that represents the admission date time. And from that, we try to calculate the hours and minutes. Further down, we do some other logic here. For example, if the guest checked in before 10 o'clock, then something should happen. And look, in the updateAdmission, we've got the exact same logic for parsing that string that represents the date time. So here is the duplicated code that we need to get rid of. How? Well, as soon as you see duplicated code, what you need to do is to select it and then press Ctrl-Shift-R. Here, ReSharper knows that we want to extract a method from this code. So let's go ahead with that. We're going to create a method. Let's call it getTime. Okay. ReSharper thinks we need to return a number from this, which represents the hours. And that's not quite what we want. We want both the hours and the minutes. So we need to do some tweaking here. Let's look at the parameters. So currently we've got admission date time, which is a string. That's good. And as you saw, we return an integer, which is just the hours. Well, the first step we need to do is to return both hours and minutes. How can we do that? Ideally, we want to return an object like time, but we don't have a time class yet, and it's not possible to use this dialog box to tell ReSharper to create this method and return a time object, because ReSharper does not know how to modify the code inside that method to construct a time object. So we need to do step-by-step refactoring. The first thing I want to do is I want to change the return type from integer hours to void. Now you see hours immediately became an output parameter. Okay, next thing I want to do is I select minutes here. So now you see we have two output parameters, hours and minutes. Yes, we know output parameters are code smells and we learn how to refactor that. But again, we are doing step-by-step refactoring, so let's go ahead with that for now. Okay, beautiful. We got rid of that piece of code here. Let's do the same thing here in the admitGuest method. So all we have to do is basically select this bit here and replace it with something like this. Now, next thing we want to do is to get rid of these output parameters. So we put the cursor here, Ctrl-Shift-R, and now we select Transform Out Parameters. So you learn that when you transform out parameters, ReSharper tries to return a tuple. In this case, it's trying to transform this method from this shape into a method that gets a string and returns a tuple of integer and integer, which is hours and minutes. So let's go ahead with that. Okay, that's better now. And notice that ReSharper automatically updated both our methods, admitGuest and updateAdmission, to get a tuple. See, that's why we use step-by-step safe refactoring. If you go manually change the return type, you're going to have a lot of breaking changes. Okay, now the next step is I want to get rid of the tuple and replace it with a time class. So let's go on the top, create a class called time. I'm going to create a constructor. And here we want to receive two values, hours and minutes. Now I put the cursor here on hours, press Alt and Enter, and have ReSharper create and initialize an automatic property for me. Look, here's the second option. There you go. So we did not have to manually go and type all this stuff here. Let's do the same with minutes. So I put the cursor here, Alt and Enter, create and initialize auto property minutes. Beautiful. I just made a tiny mistake here, and that is, if you remember in one of the previous lectures, we cannot immediately replace a tuple with a different type. We need to make that type, in this case time, to look like a tuple first. So instead of having properties like hours and minutes, we want to have item 1 and item 2. And later we can apply rename refactoring to them. So let's go here. We're going to rename these to item 1 and this one to item 2. Good. Now we go to this getTime method again. We press Ctrl and F6 to change the signature. Remember, if you forget that, just press Ctrl-Shift-R, and the first item, as you see, is change signature. Now we want this method to return a time instead of a tuple. Let's go ahead. Beautiful. Let's take a look at the method. Ctrl-B to jump to the method. Look, now it's returning a time object. We just have one breaking change in this method, which is because ReSharper could not figure out how to instantiate a time object. But the good thing is we have only one breaking change. All the clients of this method, like updateAdmission and admitGuest, continue to work properly. Again, this is the power of step-by-step safe refactoring. So what I'm going to do is, I fix this problem here first. So instead of returning a tuple, we return a time object. And we passed hours and minutes here. Good. There are no more compile time errors in this file. How can I tell? Look at this icon here. It's just telling me there are 4 warnings, which means there are areas that we can improve. If you see a red icon, that means this code is not going to get compiled. And if you see green, that means this code is clean and beautiful. Now let's go and fix this issue with item 1 and item 2. So getTime now returns a time object, not a tuple. So first thing I'm going to do is rename this variable to time. There you go. And now I'm going to rename this property to hours. So change that to hours. Let's go ahead with that. And here we do the same. Item 2 is going to be changed to minutes. Beautiful. Now, see, in this example, I directly modified the property name here when I'm using that. So I didn't have to go to the time class itself to apply that rename refactoring. So that was a bit faster. Now you see we have a proper clean class called time, which has 2 meaningful properties, hours and minutes, and a method that gets a string and returns, that should be a time. Let's rename that. Excellent. Now look, we can take this a bit further. These 2 variable declarations are redundant. So what we can do is put the cursor here, Ctrl-Shift-R, and we can inline them. We can do the same thing with minutes, but in this code, as you see, minutes is not used, so it's grayed out, which means if I try to inline that, it actually removes the variable. So let's go ahead with that. Well, it's telling me no usage is found, so basically we press Alt and Enter and remove unused local variable. There you go. Let's do the same with the other method. So we inline hours and get rid of minutes. Much better. So this way we got rid of duplicated code, and now we have a proper method that knows how to parse a string and return a time object. Okay, there is just one thing here that is bugging me a little bit. Look at where this method is placed, this getTime method. It's inside our hotel reservation, check-in, check-out, admission kind of thing. All this method is doing is to take a string and return a time object. It knows nothing about the admission, about check-in, about hotel. What if we want to use this logic, this method, in another context? Maybe a different project. We don't want to reference this class, which is about hotel check-in and check-out. So this method really does not belong here. It belongs to the time class itself. So we need to move it. How we can do that? We put the cursor here. Again, Control-Shift-R. And this time we select Move to another type. The shortcut for that is F6. Now sometimes when you're moving methods around, ReSharper can detect where that code should be moved to. It's not always reliable, but it's a good starting point. Now in this case, it could not detect that. So we need to tell ReSharper that we want to move this method to the time class. And look, here we can change the access modifier. I want this method to be a public static method, not a private one, because otherwise we cannot access it. So let's make it public. Go ahead. Beautiful. And look, again, with step-by-step safe refactoring, ReSharper automatically updated our update admission and admit guest methods to call the static getTime method of the time class. So we did not have to manually change these two methods, which is great. Okay, now the other thing that's bugging me here is we are asking the time class to give me a time and passing a string. A better name here is parse. So as you know, with parse method like integer.parse or datetime.parse, we pass a string and we get an object of a different type. So let's rename this method here with F2, parse. There you go. Now let's go to the implementation. So with Control B. Last thing I want to change here is this parameter name, admission datetime. Again, this class knows absolutely nothing about the hotel context. We may want to reuse this class in other contexts. So instead of referring to admission datetime, I'm going to change that to just str. That represents a string. Okay, now ReSharper noticed that we're using that admission datetime in other places, like here. Let's put this away. So in our parse method, we also have this argument exception that has a string called admission datetime. ReSharper is asking us, do you also want to rename that? Of course we want. So next. Okay, we're almost done with this refactoring. Now we have a proper time class that we can reuse to parse a string and get a time object. Now this method is not really the best way to implement parsing of a datetime for two reasons. One is there are a lot of conditional if, else, this throw exception repeated twice. It just looks a little bit weird. Plus, we are not doing any kind of validation. What if the hours that is sent in this string is 15? Well, 15 is not a good example because 15 is 3 p.m. Let's say what if it's 55? We don't have 55 hours. Plus, as you see, ReSharper knows that these initializations are unnecessary and that's why they're grayed out. We don't want to get into too much details here. So I leave the rest to you to do as an exercise on your own, but the purpose of this lecture was to remove duplicated code. So next time you see duplicated code, remember the dry principle. Don't repeat yourself. Use the extract method refactoring to move that duplicated code into one place. And then see if where you move the method to is the right place. If not, feel free to move it around. You saw that we moved the parse method into the time class. In the next lecture, we'll take a look at comments. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and thank you for watching.